And Agastya's mission was to spark curiosity, to nurture creativity, and to reintroduce the innovative spirit into Indian education. And it didn't want to do this at the college level, it wanted to do this at a very grassroots level. The idea was that if you can intervene in a child's educative journey at a very young age, perhaps between the ages of 10 and 15, then what you can do is potentially show them the value of curiosity, show them the value of creativity and learning, and imbibe in them a spirit of innovation that will then survive even beyond their school and college days. I want to paint three pictures for you. The first picture is that of Indian education as it used to be many years ago, centuries ago even. And that is a picture of pride, because the education of India in yesteryears was one that allowed for a lot of innovation, it allowed for a lot of ideas, and it allowed for free thinkers and scientists to come out of the Indian subcontinent. The second picture is a little more bleak. It is the system of education that evolved, or otherwise you might say devolved, over time. And it's the system that has prevailed, you could say, in the last 75 years or so. And the reason I say it's bleak is because in this system, the idea is that free thought and innovative spirit and the generation of new and novel ideas is somewhat restricted. And then a third picture, which again brings back some of the hope and some of the pride that we saw in the first picture. Because in the third picture, I will describe a group of people that came together at the turn of the century and started trying to bring some of the elements of picture one into picture two, and thereby changing the landscape of Indian education. So as you may have guessed, picture one is the Gurukul system. And there was a time in India when a student would not just go to be taught by the teacher, but would rather live the teacher's life and would be a part of their lives and would not only learn subjects, would not only learn science and maths, but would understand what it meant to think and to have a spirit of inquiry, which ultimately led to all the ideas and the innovations that we saw. And it was a time quite rich with productive thought. And it was a time when India did much of its work that we now look back on and marvel at in terms of science, in terms of astronomy, and many other fields of study. The second picture emerged maybe 75 years ago, and you might blame colonialism, you might blame the sheer volume of population in India. And it is what we call the Lancastrian model of education. Now, in this model, the idea was less about having a spirit of inquiry. It was less about debate. It was less about discussion. It was more about how do we churn as many graduates out of the school and college systems as we possibly can. And in order to make the Lancastrian system work, it was very important to abandon a lot of the ideas that had made the Gurukul system work so well. And so we had a system of rote learning, which, as we say, is when students are forced to memorize knowledge rather than really truly understand it. We had a system of exam-based answerism, where it was more important to have the right answer than to arrive at the answer through productive thought. And we had a system where teaching, understandably, had become a profession of the last resort. Teachers, again, because the ratio of students to teachers had become so high, it was difficult to see that there was any joy in the teaching profession. And so most people that became teachers and have continued to a large extent did so not because they loved teaching, but because there was nothing else for them to do. And as you can understand, this was not very conducive to a joyous educational experience for children. Someone once described Indian education as a 100 meters race on steroids. And when you look at some of the criteria for which a student is judged, for which a student is deemed successful, you start to understand that yes, expecting every child to get 98, 99, 100% is obviously not going to lead to the kind of to the kind of children and the kind of thinkers that we want in the country. The other thing that this system does is it combines fear and education in a very real way. We always believe that fear and education cannot go hand in hand, because when a student is afraid that they're going to fail, or if they're afraid they're not going to come first, it hampers in many ways their own ability to think freely and to engage and to enjoy the process of learning. Cut to 1999, and a group of people came back and said, I think there's something we should do about education in India. That it's all very well that we have IITs, and it's all very well that we have students coming out of the engineering colleges, but how many of these students actually have the spirit of inquiry? How many of them actually use creativity and curiosity in the journey that they take to attaining their degrees? One of these people was an eminent scientist. His name was Dr. P.K. Iyengar, and he was the former head of the Atomic Energy Commission. And P.K. Iyengar was the one who had said earlier that Indian education is like a 100-meter race on steroids. Because what he had found in his work, when he tried to recruit young graduates into science programs across the country, was that many of them had impressive degrees, had scored extremely well in their exams, but when they were asked to solve problems from first principles, or when they were asked to solve problems to which they may not have already been aware of what the solution might be, they were stumbling, and they were finding it very difficult to apply creative thought to the way that they were finding solutions. And this worried him. And so along with 4 others, they started the Agastya Foundation. And Agastya's mission was to spark curiosity, to nurture creativity, and to reintroduce the innovative spirit into Indian education. And it didn't want to do this at the college level. It wanted to do this at a very grassroots level. The idea was that if you can intervene in a child's educative journey at a very young age, perhaps between the ages of 10 and 15, then what you can do is potentially show them the value of curiosity, show them the value of creativity and learning, and imbibe in them a spirit of innovation that will then survive even beyond their school and college days. The other thing that we wanted to do was to bring the teacher back to the classroom. Agastya genuinely believed that while students certainly weren't being taught the principles of creative learning through purely textbook learning, that the teachers themselves had become very disillusioned, and that unless the teachers were trained and taught to understand the subject the way the students were being taught to understand it, with joy and with inclusivity, the teachers themselves could never be expected to create the classroom environment that students desperately needed. This brings us to the question of what is education? Agastya was trying to answer this question from the beginning. And as I said, they believed the 3 pillars were creativity, curiosity, and innovative spirit. And when we look at how education has evolved over the last 50 or maybe 100 years, we realize that while there may have been a time when education was a transfer of knowledge, that is to say, I had to go to school in order to learn certain facts about the world. I had to go to school to know which year World War II started. I had to go to school to understand how a combustion engine works, for example. That was no longer a necessity for a child. In the current information age, we often find that facts and information have been largely democratized. Anyone with a smartphone can access this kind of information. So this isn't particularly what Agastya was trying to push to the kids. Rather, they were trying to say, how is the journey of education? How do you teach a child to think? So the question is not what do you think, it's how do you think? And the idea was, do we treat education as purely a transfer of knowledge, or do we treat it as a path to discovery that then allows the child to apply that tool to any aspect of their lives and presumably level up or become better versions of themselves? Agastya did this in a very grassroots, ground-up way. It started creating low-cost models and taking these models into villages and government schools. And the idea was to take children out of the classroom where they might be learning a certain theory in their textbooks and giving them hands-on experiential exposure to the same concepts but in a practical sense. So a child might be sitting in class learning about how the human body, how the lungs of the human body take in air. He might step out and see an Agastya instructor with a model of the human lung, showing him how exactly the air is pulled into the lungs. And what this does, Agastya believed, was to spark curiosity, because a child might find the textbook quite dry and boring, but when they see it in action, they obviously have a much deeper and a much uh, more wonderful appreciation for what the science is actually trying to tell them. And this extends across the realm, you could say, of science, of mathematics, and later on, as Agastya found out, across arts and humanities as well. The other thing Agastya did was to initiate a teacher training program. As I said, it was very important for them that the teachers themselves find joy in the learning process. And so Agastya became one of the largest teacher training foundations, programs in the world. They also initiated things like peer-to-peer learning. They found it extremely helpful when a child tries to teach another child a topic. So one of the things they found out was that when you learn something and you read something, you have a certain amount of retention in terms of what you've learned and read. But when you try and teach someone else the same thing, the retention level goes up manifold. So it is far more effective when a child tries to teach what it's learned to another child in terms of ensuring that that child has truly understood the concepts. So this became the center of Agastya's peer-to-peer learning programs. And eventually what resulted was a hub and spoke model, wherein Agastya has science centers around the country. These science centers feed mobile vans and bikes, and these vans and bikes take the experiments along with their instructors to schools and spend time with children, and depending on their age group, accordingly works with them on those principles of science that they might be learning from their textbooks. And the reason it's effective, as I said, is when a child sees experiments in action, when it sees hands-on science, and when it sees these low-cost experiments that they're not afraid to play with, to break sometimes, and to reassemble, and when they understand that the Agastya instructor, as we call them, ignaters, are not trying to force them to give the right answer, but are rather making them a part of the journey of discovery that comes in finding that right answer, then what you do is you start, in a real sense, separating fear and education, as we had said, is something that you must do. Today, Agastya operates in about 23 states in India. It has science centers all over the country. It has a huge 172-acre campus in the town of Gurupalli near Kuppam in Andhra Pradesh. And the campus is the ideation center of Agastya. It is where a lot of the models are developed. It is where a lot of thinkers congregate to have workshops on what are the new teaching methods and the teaching models that Agastya should be adopting as time goes by. And it is also an ecological marvel, because the land that Agastya acquired 25 years ago was an arid wasteland, and Agastya has used organic ecological methods to revive the land and make it an oasis that it is today. So in a very real sense, Agastya applied creativity and curiosity not just as a tagline that it was trying to sell to kids in disadvantaged families and in rural sections of the population, but rather applying that creativity and curiosity to itself and using it as a tool to develop its own methods and indeed to develop its campus into the beautiful campus that it is today. Today, Agastya reaches 5 million children and about 250,000 teachers. It is a powerhouse in the education sector, and it continues to do the kind of work that others look at and appreciate for the kind of change that it's bringing about in the education space. Interactive science, and we try and make sure that the child is the center of that journey. One of the other things Agastya has done very well is to bring the girl from the back to the front of the classroom. Much of Agastya's early work observed that while boys were quite boisterous and would put their hands up and answer questions and even engage in debate with the teachers, the girls were usually quiet and relegated to the back of the classroom. Agastya's work allowed children to find more confidence. They allowed children to understand that it was okay to disagree, to ask why, to even have debates with their teachers, because that's what the instructors and ignaters of Agastya were encouraging them to do. And when they showed that it was okay, they immediately found that girls at the back of the class were starting to put their hands up, were starting to ask questions, were starting to contribute, and were starting to slowly come to the front of the class and even take leadership roles and become opinion leaders in their own setting. In a sense, What Agastya did and started out as STEM learning, it turned into something very different. It started out as science learning for children, and it started out with three pillars. That was curiosity, creativity, and innovation. And to this, two more pillars were added, which were confidence and caring. And the reason for this was when Agastya started doing its interventions, when it started interacting with children, when it made it okay for the child to debate, to discuss, and to encourage a spirit of inquiry within themselves, it also gave them a sense of confidence, not only for science, but for many aspects of their own strengths that the child may not have known they had. One of the features of Indian education is, unfortunately, is that we give, and may not be only Indian education, but education in general, is that we give a lot of importance to linguistics and we give a lot of importance to logic. And so maths and science and maybe languages are treated as intellectual subjects. We don't give enough importance to things like music, to the arts. We don't give as much importance to kinesthetic skills, spatial intelligence, and a child may not have scientific intelligence or be a naturally born gifted scientist or a mathematician, but they may have other skills. They may be excellent in debate. They may be excellent mediators. They may understand other people to the point where they could do a job or a role that makes them great and requires them to handle people in a very real way. And when you allow a child to explore their own strengths, you start instilling in them the confidence that even if marks aren't necessarily the end goal, there's no reason that they can't succeed in the world and change their own circumstances. Many of the children Agastya reaches are from underprivileged families, are from disadvantaged backgrounds. Their parents typically are in the primary sector or construction or possibly housekeeping and janitorial work. And many of these kids, through Agastya, allow themselves to aspire to something far more. And if you look at the change that Agastya has brought with a lot of its young instructor leaders, that its key peer-to-peer learning programs, you find that within a generation, a lot of the kids have gone from their parents being primarily in farming to the children being in the secondary and tertiary sectors. So that is a very tangible impact that has happened possibly over just a single generation. If we look at the analogy of marks and understand why marks aren't necessarily important, one of the things we're trying to say is if you look at only a single aspect of what a child does, then it's a very difficult way to assess that child. One common analogy I use is, of course, with cricket, which is, again, something that is very dear to India and very ingrained in a lot of us. But cricket batting averages were traditionally the only way you judged a batsman. If a player played at state level and they had a high average, there was a high chance that they would make it to the national stage. The result was that batsmen became very possessive of their averages and would do whatever they could to protect that average. And as a result, and oftentimes, they would do this even at the expense of perhaps even losing the match. So what was happening was players were coming on to the international stage and continuing to protect their averages because that is what they'd been taught to do and that is what their mindset was fixed on. And again, the result was you had a team of gifted players, extremely good batsmen, but not necessarily match winners. And so India wouldn't win that many matches back in the 80s and 90s. And then we saw commercialization develop. We saw more money going into cricket. The popularity of the sport drew in investors and the infrastructure started to improve. The bandwidth of selectors to evaluate players started to increase. And the moment this started happening, you suddenly found players being evaluated on metrics that were earlier unknown. So you started looking for players who were genuine match winners. You started looking at players who, even if their average wasn't extremely high, were somehow making all their runs in crisis situations when the rest of the team was unable to play. You found players who, again, had natural flair as leaders and were able to rally the team around them and create a dressing room full of motivated players. And when you started doing this and pulling those players up to the national stage, then you started seeing a very different kind of national team emerge. A team of winners and a team that was composed of people with not just batting averages, but eclectic strengths that combined to make winning teams. When you look at only marks, you're effectively only looking at the batting average. What Agastya is trying to do is to say, we have to look more holistically at the child and look at the strengths that may not only be showing up on their mark sheets, but will undoubtedly show up as the child grows up and learns to harness those strengths. To this end, we always say that there was a time back in the Lancastrian system where the most important thing about education was considered the 3 R's, which was reading, writing, and arithmetic. Agastya took this concept and said that they wanted to dismantle it, because according to Agastya, the only 3 things that matter are the 3 A's, which is ah, aha, and ha-ha. And this has become a kind of a war cry, or you could say a tagline that Agastya loves to say. Because what does it mean? It means ah is the spirit of inquiry. It is the curiosity. It is the sound you make when you see something that you want to understand but you can't quite fathom. It is your mind's curiosity being sparked. And then, of course, comes the aha, as you would say. An aha moment is when someone finds the answer. It's when they realize what the answer is. And when you say that, it's the child learning the answer that they were looking at. So I'm watching a DC motor work, for example, and I'm curious, how is this thing spinning round and round? That's my ah. And then, of course, you have the aha moment, is when you understand how electricity and magnetism come together to make this thing rotate. And finally, you have ha-ha, which is what Agastya says is the joy you derive from having that knowledge. A child that knows how to do something, how to make a motor, how the solar system works, how plants germinate, will invariably go out and try and use that knowledge to make something new. And Agastya's children are always experimenting with new devices, with new contraptions, with new inventions, because that is the ha-ha of knowing the theory and knowing the practice that emerges from understanding the theory to the greatest extent. I'm going to end by saying that there was a time when Indians were considered to be excellent clerks. Just after the British left, and perhaps even just before, there was this idea that if you wanted a good accountant, or if you wanted a good administrator who would just sit in one place, do the work and not complain, then it was great to have an Indian who made very good clerks. Cut to a few decades later, and Indians stepped out, started going out into the world, went to many developed countries, and started establishing themselves as very good middle managers. Now the reputation was Indians make great middle managers. Again, they get the job done, they're effective, they're hardworking, they don't cause a lot of fuss, and they're diligent and smart. And that was good. It was a leg up. Today, and especially we've seen over the last perhaps decade or so, Indians are making great CEOs. Some of the largest companies in the world today have Indians at the helm. So we've become excellent as stewards of large companies. So if you've built a large company, it would be best to have an Indian at the helm, because we're excellent in steering the ship and making sure everything is held together. And again, that's a wonderful thing. But what I would like to see is an age, perhaps, and it's coming, maybe 10, 15 years down the line, when Indians make great innovators, when Indians make great thinkers, and Indians make great entrepreneurs who shape the world around them. I think that is the future that we need to plan for. And it is a future that Agastya has been laying the foundation for a quarter of the century. Thank you.